Good evening, everyone. We're delighted to welcome you all to the Geological Society's November public lecture. Before we begin, a few housekeeping points. We're not expecting a fire alarm during today's lecture, so if the alarm sounds, please treat it as real. The fire exits can be found at the back of the theatre and to the side of the stage here. The muster point is located outside the Royal Astronomical Society in the courtyard. So if you've got any questions or require any assistance during evacuation, please look for staff who are identifiable with the yellow lanyards. So there will be a Q&A session after the talk today. For those of you who are joining us in person, during the Q&A session, please just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, excuse me, and someone will come around with the microphone so that those online can actually hear the question. And for our virtual attendees, you'll be able to submit your questions via the Q&A function and we will read out the question for you. There will be a drinks reception taking place after the talk in the lower library. So for those of you in the room, please do join us after the talk if you can. We are proud to partner with KSAT, who are supporting our public lecture program throughout 2025. And this collaboration enables us to share cutting-edge insights and geoscientific discoveries with public audiences, which broadens our reach and amplifies the impact of our science program. So this evening, I'm delighted to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Siri Crouch. Siri's a senior energy industry leader with over 30 years of experience and nearly 2 decades of carbon capture, storage and sequestration, including serving as Shell's VP for CCS, where she reshaped global strategy and oversaw a multi-billion-dollar project portfolio. She's now the CEO and co-founder of Energex CCS, advising governments, industry, and investors on energy transition strategy, and serves on the boards of Climeworks and Recarver. Over to you, Siri.
Hi, and thank you. Very happy to be here today. I don't know. Yes, there we go. So title of my talk is actually Returning CO2 or Fossil CO2 to the Fossil Record. And the whole thing here is it's the recognition of where we are in the energy transition. And actually part of it is related to our addiction to energy sources. So I'm going to start off with this, and I'll make an apology right up front. I'm not a paleontologist. I'm actually a hard rock or structural geologist by background, and that's many, many moons ago as well. But this is our planet, yeah? And it's Earth, and it's the perfect distance in time and space from the prime source of energy, the sun, yeah? And it is, as far as we know, the only planet with life on it at the moment. And I'm a geologist. I'm presuming most of you in this room at least have a passing interest in geology if you are not geologists yourself. And so, you know, what we do is we study the Earth, yeah? And the whole thing here is that we know the Earth isn't static, yeah? It's been changing and it's changed. It's 4.5 billion years old, roughly, of which there's been life on Earth for about 3.5 billion years of that. So I'm going to give you a really potted history, yeah? So life on Earth started about 3.5 billion years ago. It was pretty boring, single-cell organisms. 900 million years ago, there was a sudden change, and we ended up with multi-cell organisms. 540 million years ago, there was the Cambrian explosions, and all sorts of organisms developed. Some of those first skeletal remains, actually, you can see in the project I delivered in Canada, the CCS project I delivered in Canada. It was stored in the pre-Cambrian sandstones, and our seal is where you could actually put your finger on it and say that's when life on Earth started, and you could find some of these fossils in that. About 400 million years ago, we got tetrapods, which are the ancestors to all mammals, birds, amphibious life today. Then we got insects. And then again, 300 million years ago, we got the first predators, a mesosaur that ate the amphibians and other sea creatures. And then 250 million years ago, we got dinosaurs. And it took them 50 million years to become the dominant life form on Earth. 200 million years ago, mammals first came into existence. They were small, not very exciting, but then you didn't want to be exciting if there was a dinosaur around, did you, in that sense? 66 million years ago, mammals became the dominant life form and primates emerged. Humans came onto the scene a mere 300,000 years ago. So for the history of the planet, we have been around for 0.004% of its history. And yet, look at the impact we're having on the planet. So the key thing here is there's a lot of talk. If you read the newspapers and things like that, or you see people protesting, it's about saving the planet. But actually, it's not. It's about saving ourselves. The planet will survive, new life forms will emerge, etc. And so the key thing I always want to say to people when they say to me, we've got to save the planet is no, Earth will survive. It's been through this before. And actually, the key thing is in the last 100 years, we've got life forms going extinct 100 times faster than they have previously. And that's why I put up there the mass extinctions or the biggest disasters in history, the great dying events, as you can see them called. And there's been 5 of them in the Earth's history. And what you can see is all of those are related to some degree to CO2 levels. Either there has been too little CO2, which means that we ended up with it being very cold, or there's been too much CO2, and therefore, indeed, we've ended up with heat, etc. Now, most of that has been related to natural events. The first time when it got too cold, it was actually the advent of so many living organisms creating oxygen and the CO2 levels plummeting, and so we ended up with a cold period. Other ones are related to volcanism, asteroids hitting, etc. And so what you can see here are the great dying events. I've marked them with little temperature anomalies for when it was too hot or too cold. And of course, we now hit the latest one, which is, are we hitting the next great extinction event? I mentioned already, living organisms are going extinct 100 times faster than expected. Difference is, this time, the driver of that is actually the dominant life form. It's ourselves. And so the question is, do we have the capacity and the capability to make decisions to change that? And I think that's what I want you to bear in mind as I go through this talk, if you like. Yeah. And the key thing here is the longer we wait to make these changes, the more drastic the decisions we have to make will be in that sense. So if you look at this, and COP is actually ongoing as we speak. I've been to a few of the COP events, and I've picked out a few things. The latest global stocktakers just happened. The global stocktakers, when we all look at the CO2 emissions which are happening globally, and we say, what does it mean? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for the planet? What does it mean for the temperature, etc.? So we're still reaching record high in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. They're sitting there saying we actually created a record of 3.2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent was emitted in 2024. We've got a shrinking carbon budget. We actually think it's pretty much impossible now to stay under 1.5 degrees centigrade. And there's a 50% chance that by 2028, we will have exceeded that, our carbon budget. So the projected warming now is that we are en route for 2.5 to 3 degrees effectively by the end of the century, long way away from the Paris agreements. The global stocktake says we need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030 compared to our 2019 levels if we are going to limit global warming to that 1.5 degrees. So stabilising our climate means we need to substantially reduce our emissions, and that means we've got to understand where they are coming from and how we can manage them. So I've put a few pie charts, and these pie charts are actually about 2 or 3 years old now, but reality is the message hasn't radically changed in that sense. So what you can see here is indeed you've got different greenhouse gas emissions don't think CO2 is the only one we've got to worry about. There's methane, nitrous oxide, etc. This is actually looking at them by economic sector. So indeed, you can see electricity, heat production, agriculture, forestry, transportation, effectively life as we know it. Yeah, our industrial life is driving this. Too often we think it is just looking at indeed our use of oil and gas in terms of personal transportation, etc. It isn't. And then this is actually looking at where do those emissions come from today. It does not, that pie chart does not represent historical emissions in that sense. Yeah. So I'm going to deal with this in a couple of buckets. The first one will be looking at energy consumption. And what you've got here is indeed the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And actually I've put here the global population in billions, because the two are intricately linked. Back in the start of the Industrial Revolution, there had never been more than 1 billion people on the planet up to that time. Why? Because work was hard, life expectancy was short. If you reached over 35 years of age, you were doing pretty well back then. So I hate to say, looking around this room, most of us would be in trouble, myself included, okay? To date, we're at 9 billion people on the planet. When I came into existence in the 1960s, there were only 3 billion of us here, yeah? And so the key thing is, if you look at this, there's 8 billion people on the planet, but only 10% of them have our lifestyles. And guess what? That other 90% want what we take for granted. And if we say they cannot have access to energy, you are telling them they don't have the right to have the lifestyle you have enjoyed. And that is a very difficult message to transport across, yeah? Yeah, so the remaining 90% want to join us as the 10% in that sense. So I want to deal with energy access. So energy has created that world, that industrial revolution has created the world that we enjoy now. It's created the GDP growth, all of our advances in that sense. In 200 years, what you can say is effectively we have used 500 million years worth of stored solar energy. Yeah, because that's what it is. The use of fossil fuels is solar energy from the past that has been concentrated and stored. And the other thing is, each 15 litres of petrol that we burn is approximately 1 man-year of work. So if you take that and you look at how much we have burned since the Industrial Revolution, it means we have had the benefit of an additional 500 billion people to create the infrastructure, the world, the agriculture in those 200 years. There is nothing that could have replaced that in terms of our GDP growth, in terms of enabling that population growth, etc. So the next thing is, well, what about renewables? It's critical. Everyone is going as fast as they can in that space. But to date, and I'm only saying to date because hopefully it has changed. If you look at this, this is our energy consumption. And what you will see is that renewable wedge has just been additional. It hasn't replaced our use of fossil fuels to date. And you can sit there and say, well, in the UK, it has. But okay, it's replaced it in the UK. The fossil fuel usage has just gone to India, to China, to the developing world. And they have picked up the shall we say, excess capacity in the system. And then if we do look at indeed renewables, well, they don't come CO2 free. Yeah, every windmill is 1,000 tons of steel. Yeah, it's 5 tons of copper. Every ton of steel is 1.4 tons of CO2, and every ton of copper is 4.1 tons of CO2. And that is for one windmill. To get 1.2 gigawatts of power, you need 174 windmills. So you still have a CO2 footprint. So even if we stop burning fossil fuels now, and we went hell for leather for developing solar, for developing windmills, we're still going to have a CO2 addition to the budget that we need to handle and deal with. And then finally, you know, everyone loves the idea of hydrogen, that you burn it and all you get is water. fantastic, but you've got to make the hydrogen in the first place. And it only has an energy efficiency of 75%, and that means you would need the UK's North Sea output, 13 gigawatts, to make 1 million tonnes of hydrogen. That would not cover our power-hungry lifestyles at all. So that's energy, and like I say, we're addicted to energy. There's no two ways about it. If you look at our lifestyles where we use more and more compute power, you hear of AI, that's going to require more energy. Every time you save a photo to your phone, that has a power consumption to it. Now let's look at the other parts of our lifestyle. Those 9 billion people, sorry, we all want somewhere to live. Concrete. There is no replacement at the moment for concrete, and CO2 is a fundamental part of their processing cycle. You emit CO2 as you create cement. It's responsible for 8% of the global world emissions, and actually it's increasing because there's such a drive. We are building at the moment a city the size of New York every year. Now globally, it's not, you know, in one location, but that is the equivalent. That's an awful lot of concrete. So it has gone up from 4.2 billion to 6.2 billion tonnes by 2050, and that's driven mainly by the developing nations. So unless we can get a handle on the CO2 emissions of concrete, again, we've still got an issue to look at. I've already mentioned steel production. Well, that's 11% of global CO2 emissions. And again, you can't build a city like New York without an awful lot of steel. The other part there is they're also still reliant on coal for a lot of their reducing processes. And then finally, well, there's a lot of talk in the UK about health services and things like that. You want sterile equipment, you want plastics, you want that side of things. You need petrochemicals. And equally, if you want to feed 9 billion people, you need pharmaceuticals, you need fertilizers, you need refrigerants, you need plastics. So that side of the industry is another 10% of the global emissions. So even if we replace fossil fuels in our power sector, we still have the hard-to-abate industries that we need to deal with. So this is looking at the role of carbon reductions, and by that I'm using CCUS, that's carbon capture and storage. CDRs is a carbon dioxide removal. So that's when you're taking CO2 out of the system and storing it underground, and I'll come back to that in a minute. What you can see here is there are various different scenarios. There's the IEA, so the International Energy Agency, the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change. I can't remember the initials of ETC, what that stands for. Oxford Smith, which is Oxford University's climate group, and then the Shell Sky scenarios. What you can see is they have a low and a high case of how much CCS will be required. The low case assumes we move as fast as we can towards the renewable sector. The high case is where we're actually en route to at the moment, which is we do not deploy renewables fast enough, and therefore we will require more carbon capture and storage. What you can see here is it ranges. The lowest case is 3 gigatons. The highest case is 30 gigatons per annum. That's an awful lot of CO2. When I first got into this, I started going, what on earth's a gigaton? Yeah, how the heck do I understand what a gigaton of CO2 is? So I did a bit of Googling and comparisons here. So, well, 1 million tons is the size of the project I delivered in Canada almost 20 years ago now. And that is the equivalent of taking 200,000 cars off the road. A gigaton, if you put the entire 9 billion people of the world on a scale, we weigh half a gigaton. It's kind of frightening, isn't it? If you put the global production of plastics, that is a gigaton. First of all, that to me was quite shocking when I first did that we actually use twice as much plastic annually as we weigh as a population. The global meat consumption is 0.3 gigatons. And if you looked at the entire oil and gas market, that is 5 gigatons per annum. So what we're talking about is an industry that needs to get developed, which is roughly the size of the oil and gas industry as it stands at the moment, but with the flow of the molecules reversed in that sense. Yeah, I think that's... So let's step back a little bit and say, okay, what is CO2? Yeah. So it's in the air all around us. It's about 0.04% or 412 ppm. Pre the Industrial Revolution, it was 280 ppm in the atmosphere. The human body produces about 1 kilo a day because it is what triggers us to breathe. Yeah. So it's the rise of CO2 in your lungs makes you actually breathe in. Yeah. And swap it out for oxygen. We use it to put out fire. It dissolves in water to create an acid, but we drink it. I don't know about you, I'm addicted to Diet Coke, so I drink my fair share of CO2 at least once a week. It has interesting behavior. I've put a phase diagram over here, and that is that you've got gaseous, liquid, and then you've got supercritical fluid. And that means it acts like both a gas and a liquid, so you can pump it, and it's dense like a liquid, but it has a viscosity like a gas. Main advantage of that is if you look at this side over here, it shrinks rapidly in volume as you go up that phase diagram. And actually, if you can store it in its critical phase, it takes up only, it shrinks by 70%. Yeah, so it needs a lot less volume to store it in. What you can do is you can use the earth as a natural barrier, because if you go below about 800 meters, then you reach the pressure and temperature effects where it will stay in that supercritical phase. So you will see a lot of the projects globally, they are all deeper than 800 meters. Now they're deeper than that for other reasons as well, but that is one of the reasons there. It's thermodynamically stable, which means it is difficult to make it react. All the energy has been taken out of it. By the time you're left with CO2, you've removed all energy from the system. So when people talk about utilization, just think about that, because it means you've got to put a lot of energy and a lot of power back in to make it react with something. If it was reactive, we wouldn't have such a problem because it wouldn't hang around in the atmosphere quite so long. And it's one of the most talked about gases on the planet at the moment. So what is CCS? Well, CCS is where you capture CO2 from one of these processes over here. You capture it using an amine, cryogenic, solid sorbent, membrane technologies. That's a way where you strip it out of the rest of the flue gases, you concentrate it, you then compress it to make it into that critical phase, you transport it and you store it. And what you can sit there and say is, I can enable low carbon products through that, or I can create credits. And the government has a way of managing this. They can hit you with a stick, which is they sit there and say, here's a CO2 tax, here's a price to your emissions. And so by capturing it and storing it underground, I don't have to pay that tax. And then there are other elements which are starting to come into play now, which is, do you get a price premium for a lower carbon product? Can you create a negative emission credit, etc.? So if you look at this, what is a carbon credit? Well, it is 1 carbon credit is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent that is stored. And you can either sit there and say, I've got avoidance credits, or indeed I've got removal credits. And what I'm talking about are these 2 boxes in black, which are where it's removed and it's stored permanently. And that, I think, is the key thing. It's permanently stored. It's not going to come back into cycles. And that's what I mean by taking fossil CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in the fossil record. So again, if you look at definitions, you've got carbon capture and storage, and that's where you capture it from a point source. So you capture it from one of those industrial processes, be it a cement plant, be it a steel mill, be it a power generation, and you store it underground. You've got carbon dioxide removal, and that is where you take it from the atmosphere. So it's a much more dilute form of CO2. And again, you still store it underground. And you can have nature-based solutions as part of this, but actually I talk about the engineered side of it. And then finally, there's, can you utilize it? But like I say, on that one, you've got to think about your thermodynamics, you've got to think about the energy consumption, etc. So CCS is where indeed you capture the CO2. I mentioned that. It's not a new process. The oil and gas industry has been sweetening contaminated gas since the 1930s. We've actually been stripping CO2 out, transporting it and storing it underground since the 1970s, but that has mainly been for CO2 EOR, so enhanced oil recovery, which enabled more oil to be produced at that point. But the key thing is, it means that all three components, the capture, the transportation, and the storage component, have been done and have been done for many decades. And we have the capability. It's just, can we put it into practice now where we're not getting more oil out of the ground? What are the challenges? Cost, public perception. There is a fear of the unknown, if you like, and that's partially what this is about. And where are we now? Oops, sorry. Well, there's 50 million tons of CCS in operation to date, a further 32 million tons in construction, and 280 million tons per annum in development. There are 41 facilities in operation, 26 in construction, another 35 in development. So that's, and the value component can come through license to operate. So indeed, reducing your CO2 emissions, reducing those taxes, or indeed in creating lower carbon products. Or if you move outside of the EU, you may have heard of something called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That is where, to stop industry just moving to a cheaper country, they will get charged a CO2 tax on entry back into Europe, etc. I did mention direct air capture. This is slightly different. This is where, once CO2 hits the atmosphere, it is just in circulation. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. And you can take it out of the air. It's low concentrations. It's more complex. But then you can take that and equally store it underground. And that gives you what is called a negative credit. And even if we stopped all emissions going forward, we would still need to do CDRs, because we still have to deal with that legacy of CO2 emissions 200 years worth. So the temperature and global climate would still change even if we removed all emissions now, if we don't deal with the legacy emissions. And then the other one you'll hear me talk about is BECCS. BECCS is bioenergy with CCS. And the easy one here is to look at energy from waste. And we all create a lot of waste, be it food stuff, be it kitchen oils, frying oils, be it plastic. A lot of that, it used to get buried, but then you have a methane production issue. And a lot of that now is used, it's incinerated, and it's used to create power. If you capture the CO2 from creating that power and store that underground, the biogenic component of that can give you a negative emission credit. And that's what I'm showing here, where you can sit there and you can see the various components of that. So the biogenic fraction of the waste can actually give you a net CO2 reduction in that sense. So that's an awful lot of technical background to why is CCS required? What is CCS? What is DAC? What are CDRs? So now let's bring it back a little bit more to the projects and the projects in the UK. You've probably seen these in the newspapers. There's been a lot, certainly in the last year or two, of politicians being seen opening or grants being given. So there are the Track 1 clusters, which is the East Coast cluster. That's saline aquifer, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute. You've got the HyNet cluster, which is the Northwest cluster here, and that is stored in a depleted field. So it's a depleted gas field, which they're now going to reuse to store CO2. And then more recently, you've got the Track 2 clusters, which is Acorn up in Scotland and the Viking. Both of these are depleted fields. The Acorn one also has an extension piece, which is the potential for saline aquifer storage. What you can see here are the UK's industrial emissions clustered, and you can see why indeed the Northeast and the Northwest got the first two projects when you look at that map. But equally, it means we've got big emissions in other areas that we also will need to deal with. I'm also showing you here, just to show we aren't alone in this, the EU. You may have heard of Northern Lights. That is Norway. This started up this year. It is currently 1.5 million tonnes per annum. It's looking to deal with the expansion up to 5 million tonnes per annum. It is the world's first cross-border development. So they are shipping CO2 from the industrial sites of Europe to Norway and storing it underground. You've got, I'm going to come to this one last, you've got Aramis, which is depleted field. That's using the Dutch sector gas fields for storage. And again, they're looking at connecting that up into the big emissions coming out of Germany. And you've got Porthos also in Holland, which is another depleted field system. And here you can see all of the projects that are in Europe. There's something called the EU Innovation Fund, very similar to what's gone on in the UK. And then Carbfix is different. This is a DAC project. So it's where you're sucking CO2 out of the air and then storing it underground. Now there, they are mineralizing it and they are storing it in basalt. So maybe let's look at some of these in a bit more detail. Oh, sorry, I forgot this. So if you're going to store this, there are 4 key components, key criteria you need to be able to meet. Yeah. The first one is you need to understand the capacity. How much volume can you store in this particular site? Yeah. And it can be, as I mentioned, saline aquifer, depleted field, or mineralization. And that is just like a geologist or a reservoir engineer would do for any oil and gas field. You look at it in terms of your rock type, your structural closure, your thickness, net to gross, porosity, etc. Yeah, and you can calculate the volume that you can store in that particular location. The next one is, let's be honest, I'm sticking it down there. I do not want it to come back. So it's what's my containment? Yeah. So my seal is important for that. The fracture gradient, I need to do a leak path analysis, and I need to understand my trapping mechanism. And the key thing here is, like I say, is to ensure it's contained within the storage complex. Absolutely critical to protect groundwater sources. You do not want CO2 to get into your groundwater. Everyone laughs because they think of Evian or Perrier at that point in time. But actually, if CO2 travels through rock, it's actually a solvent and it can concentrate other minerals, etc., that you do not want in your groundwater. But actually, you don't want it to contaminate hydrocarbon resources or any other part of the environment. And the prime directive here is to protect human health. The next bit is injectivity. So that is how much volume can I put away? Yeah, and how fast can I put it away? In how many wells do I need in that sense? So it drives the number of wells and therefore your capex. So how much is it going to cost that scheme? And that's driven again by very normal geological thought processes, your porosity, permeability, your reservoir heterogeneity. So how connected are your rocks? The compartmentalization, and again, your structure. And then the final one is, great, so I've put it down there, I've convinced everyone it's a safe storage site, I can inject, I know how many wells I need, but now I need to be able to prove it. I need to be able to prove it to government, I need to be able to prove it to the population. And that's where your conformance comes into play, and that's showing that the CO2 is performing as I expected in that subsurface environment. And if I look at that, you've got indeed your reservoir modeling, your trapping mechanism, the geophysical properties, can I image it? And that's things like your density contrast, viscosity contrast, velocities, etc. So I mentioned trapping mechanisms, and this shows you, and again, you've got 3 different storage mechanisms. They will use different components of this. So you've got the first one, which is structural trapping, and that's just a structural closure. It's an anticline, yeah, or a fault 4-way dip closure, or a fault bounded structure. You've got solubility and mineral trapping will also occur faster if you go into a dipping setting. You've got residual trapping. So that's just the bits that are left behind as the CO2 moves through a rock. Certain bits get trapped in pore spaces and they become immobile. And then over time, you end up with solubility trapping where it dissolves in the water, but that will be dependent on your water salinity. So again, you need to understand your rocks, you need to understand the connate water, etc., that you're going to store it in. And then finally, over a long period of time, you end up with mineral trapping, but that depends on your rock mineral composition, the pressure and temperature, and it takes time. It's fastest in basalts, and it's a lot slower if you go to a very clean sandstone, if it happens at all in that sense. So quite a complex diagram, this one, but it shows you how you need to think about these things. You've got on this side all of the things you need to think about in terms of containment, capacity, injectivity, and monitorability. And that all comes into sitting there and looking at your site characterization and saying, is this a suitable site? Do I believe this is a safe space to store CO2? If my answer here is yes, then great, I can move on to, can I monitor it? Can I understand how it's behaving? If the answer is no, well, guess what? That site is nixed. You move on, yeah? But here you can sit there and say, can I monitor it? Are my storage risks acceptable? Can I actually prove to the public and to the government? Because there's one thing here, which is CCS is for the long term. It's indefinite. Now, companies aren't going to be around for hundreds of years, but hopefully there will be some form of government. So at a certain point, you will hand over this site to the government, and you need to be able to prove to them it's safe, so they will take on that liability, and that they will let you close the site and they will take it over from you. So this is, it's kind of developed almost to make you worry, but it shouldn't, because this is things that people screen against to show that it's not there. So if I've got here my injected CO2 plume, I need to look at what are my seals. I need to look at the geomechanical strength of that seal, so I know, and it limits my injection pressures. I need to understand old legacy wells. I need to understand the faulting. I need to look at the zonal isolation of old abandoned wells, because they weren't abandoned for CO2 to be injected. I need to understand potential pathways, and I need to do it for the CO2 injection plume, but actually also because if I'm injecting into a saline aquifer, it's already filled with water. I need to push that water away. So I actually have a pressure front I need to manage as well. And I need to understand that pressure front at the same time. This is CCS mineralization. And this is, again, slightly different. You're looking at injecting into basalts. And you inject, in this case, they inject water and CO2. So it's already, that forms, if you like, a carbonic acid, and that reacts with the rocks. And if you can remember your geochemistry, it will break it down, silicate minerals in such as olivine, into things like serpentinite. But the good thing is, once it's done that, it's rock and it's stored permanently. The bad thing is you need to manage an awful lot of water as well as an awful lot of CO2 in the process, which means you have to think through different components. So, and the fifth item here is indeed that one about the monitoring, measurement, monitoring and verification, or measurement, reporting and verification. And the reason for this is HSE, understanding the limits of the system, making sure we set our alarms correctly. And that will be things like the bottom hole pressure to make sure we don't exceed fracture gradients. It is actually also for our CO2 accounting. CO2 accounting is really important because as you inject the CO2, you will also emit a little bit of CO2. And you need to be able to show your carbon budget, yeah? And how much you are injecting versus how much you're emitting to make sure you only get credits for the right amount. And equally, I mentioned already the regulatory compliance component. So this is where the geophysicists get excited because what you can see here is you need to design your MMV and MRV program to cover the depth of the earth, everything from your storage locations in your geosphere, looking at what you can do within the wells, but actually also looking at your hydrosphere, so your groundwater sampling, your biosphere, and actually your atmosphere. And all of that is put into place and designed into the system. So you can see there's an awful lot of design that goes into this to make sure we know it is behaving as expected. This may be a bit much for now, but I will pick up a few pieces just to show you that there are differences and there's pros and cons of each mechanism I've mentioned. So saline aquifer, well, actually, you know least probably about that because it hasn't had a valuable resource in it. It's just had salty water. So it's been explored least. So you need to understand that system. You need to spend some money to understand it better. Depleted fields, great. You understand it. You spent 20, 30 years extracting hydrocarbons from it. But now I've got a problem. It had a perfect seal. I know it held gas or oil for millions of years, but I've poked a lot of holes in it. So now I need to understand my legacy well component and manage that piece. And then mineralization, well, I've mentioned already, you need to have, it's related to the rock interaction, and you need to inject an awful lot of water. So you need to manage not just the volume of CO2, but the volume of water that you're injecting through the system, and make sure you know where both pieces have gone. So I'm not going to deal with that. There's an awful lot of detail that other people can look at later if they're interested. I mentioned already the life cycle. So the life cycle, to a large degree, follows the same life cycle you would use for hydrocarbons. There's a screen and ranking stage, which you could call exploration and appraisal. There is the evaluation and feed stage, which is, can I make this work with my engineering colleagues? Can I justify it commercially, etc.? Then indeed, there's detailed design, construction, operation, post-closure, and then handover. The difference here is this post-closure and handover piece. And that's where, like I was saying, you need to be able to justify and show to the government you've done your job correctly, you've abandoned it correctly, that they are then willing to take over that long-term ownership, monitoring and liability hands. And that's where this MMV plan comes in and underpins it all. I mentioned already that there are different ways that you can create value through CCS. The first one is I can actually sit there and say, I've got my fossil fuel, I'm making a lower carbon product, and can I actually get us as consumers to pay a little bit more for low carbon products? And this is an interesting one because this is where you have to look in the mirror and say, am I really looking at the energy transition? Am I willing to, I don't know, buy that slightly higher price pair of trainers because they've managed their CO2 footprint in the manufacturing of it? Or am I still going to go for the bargain basement version where they haven't paid any attention to that? And you can notice some goods are starting to label it. So there is a make of trainer which labels the CO2 content of that trainer in its manufacturing process, but they are a little bit more expensive. So if you're not willing to do that, then look in the mirror and don't necessarily blame the companies, because it's us and our consumer habits which also drive this. Yeah. Then indeed, there's the voluntary carbon market, and this is where those negative credits are sold. And this is where a lot of the high-tech companies, Amazon, Google, are playing, because they know they've got big CO2 emissions, driving all of those data centers that drive our use of computing, drive our use of AI, phones, etc. That is a lot of the power consumption, and the growth of that power consumption is coming from that market. So if you go onto the CDR market, you will see the biggest purchaser of negative emission credits at the moment are Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. Yeah, again, think of your own consumption habits, because that is driving a lot of those CO2 emissions. Yeah. And then finally, compliance-based markets and the nationally determined contributions. So you may hear of that one. That is where indeed the UK government is looking at its national determined, its CO2 budget, and looking to drive that down over time. So I mentioned here, so this is looking at the EU compliance market. And this is looking at the voluntary market, and you can see that rapid jump up. It's one of the largest growing markets there is at the moment. And what you can see, indeed, it was valued in 2021, it was approaching 2 billion. They're expecting a potential 4-fold increase on that. So this means indeed that whole part about CDRs and so the carbon dioxide removal component, which is where you're taking CO2 from the atmosphere and sticking it underground, different than the point source one. is what is underpinning some of that market. To do this, you need to be able to monitor it, you need to be able to meter it, you need to be able to look at all those data sources and prove to people. So this looks at the metering you would have in one of these systems, and then this equally looks at how you would actually potentially manage that reporting for one of these complex, big industrial CCS clusters. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with some very depressing notes, but hopefully it shows that we are moving in this space. I found this online the other day and I kind of went, oh my goodness. These are 12 quotes from the world's leading scientists. And it is, if we don't work on this, are we looking at the end of civilization as we know it? And that is the whole thing about climate change, the whole drive of, shall we say, rising temperature, rising sea levels that will come, that actually it will become a very difficult world to govern in time. Yeah, but we have the time, we have the technology, we know we can do it. It is partially a matter of will, but it is also not going to be cheap. And that's where I'd like to leave it. Oh, probably need to stay up.
Yes,
Questions,
please stay with us, Siri. That was fascinating, and really enjoyed that talk. Thank you very much. We do have time for questions now. I can see that there are a couple of people here in the audience who'd like to ask some questions.
Thank you. That was an extremely informative lecture. Fascinating. You suggested, I think, early on in the lecture that the 90% of the world's population in developing economies are least likely to be preached to the 10% who have had it so good for so long. And yet, ironically, if you look at renewable energy production, China is embarrassing the rest of the world. Whereas if you look at the most developed and largest economy in the world, the United States, they've disassociated themselves from COP, which seems topsy-turvy. So is it not the case that without the political initiative, and I suppose I'm thinking of Trumpian politics now, none of this technical aspect carries any weight? You need politics behind it to drive it.
So yes, you're right. There is a lot of political will that is required behind it. I think the key thing to me is actually a lot of the rest of the world is still moving regardless of what is happening in the States. You just have to look at, when we were having a conversation just before we started, what is happening in China as we speak. So yes, they're driving the solar panels, etc. But actually they have just opened what they say is a CCS pilot. Their CCS pilot is 1 million tons per annum. They have got another 4 or 5, which is online. Now, when I was in my previous role inside Shell, we were talking with Bao Steel, which is the world's largest steel manufacturer. They were talking about putting CCS on that. We were also talking to the Nanhai Petrochemical Complex, which is the world's largest petrochemical complex. Note, it's always the world's largest. Key thing is, and this is what I think is absolutely fundamental, is the reason they were talking about that is where does a lot of that steel come? It comes to the EU. The European market is a big market. And the fact that the EU has got the ETS and to protect the European industry and making sure that industry doesn't just move to India or China, yeah, because they don't have to pay a CO2 tax, they have put the carbon border adjustment mechanism in place, which means if you are bringing a ton of steel in to the EU, but you have a much higher CO2 footprint to that steel, you will have to pay the equivalent of an ETS price or a CO2 tax on that coming into the border. And so for me, I think this is one of the most impactful pieces of legislation, because it says, you know, regardless of where you are in the world, if you want access to the European market, then you either have to pay a tax at our border, which comes to the EU, Or you look at the money you're about to spend in tax and you invest it in changing your CO2 footprint in your home company or country. Well, guess what people choose? They don't want to give it to Europe, so they'd much rather pay it and put in a longer term solution. So I've given you the example there of China. I actually am doing some work with some of the North African countries, and it's their cement comes into Europe. And they're looking at actually decarbonising their cement production because, again, they want access to the European market. So yes, America has slowed down, but interestingly, they haven't slowed down necessarily fully on CCS. They still have the 45Q, which is a tax incentive for CCS in that sense. Other areas, yes, they've stepped back from completely. CCS is still alive and kicking at the moment. We'll leave it that way.
Thank you. That's very reassuring. Thank you.
So we have a question from E. Hedges online. They ask, how much CO2 is generated during capture, transport and storage in relation to how much is stored? For example, what is the net improvement?
Right, so I can give, this will vary project by project, yeah? So I'm going to give one where I know the numbers pretty well. And that was for the 1 million tons we were looking at in Canada. Then we were storing just over the 1 million tons per annum. We were storing, we were capturing over the 1 million tons per annum. And it was something like 1.2, but we were only storing 1.05. That's the credits we got, because in driving the compressor and driving the power system, we obviously also emitted some CO2. But that is a much smaller scale one. That was 1 million tons per annum. We did that 10, 15 years ago. And the drive has been to improve the efficiency since then, because everyone recognizes what you really want is to get those credits, and you want to maximize those credits in that sense. The other one that I was involved in, or my team was heavily involved in, is the Northern Lights project. And there you can sit there and say, hang on, you're shipping CO2. There must be a big CO2 footprint to moving it in ships. But actually, if you look at the Northern Lights ships, they've got two things. They've got rotator sails. So it looks like it's a big chimney, but it's not. It's a circular sail. And that, by rotating, creates a vortex that helps pull the ship along. That means it doesn't burn as much fuel in its transportation. And the other thing that those ships are deliberately designed to do is they blow bubbles out their hull, and that actually reduces the friction. So they are much more fuel efficient and therefore CO2 efficient than the bulk of shipping. Now, some of those learnings are now being translated across into normal shipping solutions as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. You didn't talk about the sea at all. Does the sea contain a load of CO2, and how's that going to be dealt with?
So interestingly enough, one of my alma maters, if you like, I got asked to have a look at a project they're doing down in Weymouth Bay, which is to extract CO2 from the sea. Because actually, I mentioned direct air capture. There is something called direct ocean capture. And the whole concept there is that CO2 is preferentially absorbed into the sea. So actually, it does some pre-processing for you. And so in theory, it would be more effective to strip it from the seawater. What you have to then look at, though, is, of course, it's now alkaline when you're putting it back into the sea. And so you have to look at a different section of monitoring to make sure you're not impacting the environment and the benthic communities and things like that. It is work that's ongoing. Exeter University, like I say, has a working pilot in Weymouth Bay. And I know California is also looking at that to some degree as well. Yeah.
We have another question online from Sean. They ask, well, they say, thanks for the nice presentation. If we start to inject and store CO2 on a scale significant enough to offset global emissions, it is inevitable that a small percentage of projects will leak on long enough timescales, but it is still a net gain for the climate Bearing this in mind, do you think that the bar for de-risking and monitoring new sites is too high and preventing the necessary rapid upscaling?
So that's brilliant, and I would love to be able to do this. And I mentioned I did the Quest project in Canada years ago. That was the first of a kind. It was the first onshore industrial scale storage, and the key thing was actually public perception. We couldn't afford for it to fail because we would potentially kill off an industry before it started. And so I think there is an element which is these first projects are over-engineered and over-designed, but actually with time and as people get more comfortable with it, then indeed we will relax some of these. And actually one of the things that I also challenge the EU around is letting the perfect get in the way of the good. And it is that thing that actually we need to start, and we need to do this, and we need to do it at scale. And if you wait for it to be perfect, then there's a risk we never start. Yeah. So the answer is yes, I agree with you. But the first ones, I think we have to make sure work and make sure work well, simply to bring the bulk of public with us.
Thank you. So we have another one online. Isaac Weisler asked, I've noticed that despite the field being deeply grounded in geology, the work seems to sit within increasingly interdisciplinary teams. From your experience, how do you see the role of geoscientists evolving in CCS, and what pathways should aspiring geologists be looking for if they would like to contribute meaningfully to the sector?
I'm a geologist. Or at least I still consider myself a geologist even after all this time. But like any big major project, you have to work with an interdisciplinary team. This is not one discipline on its own. You need the geoscience, you need reservoir engineer, you need the facilities engineer, you need process engineers. And actually, to me, that's what makes it so interesting. Yeah. Because it's not only that you have to know your own discipline, but you actually have to understand how your discipline interacts with other ones. And so it's how do you take your deep geological knowledge and apply it in a different manner, yeah? And how do you actually communicate what you know about the rocks and that sealing and storage and capacity potential I mentioned, and translate that across to the public to bring them on board with you? Because if you talk about sealing and you talk about fracture gradients and things, you may talk about it in terms of managing a risk, but the public may hear it in terms of there's this huge risk, and you have to learn how to communicate your knowledge that it can be understood by others. That's it.
Very good. I'd like to really thank Siri once again for giving up her free time to come and give this talk. It's been a while in preparation, I know, and thank you very much for all your efforts. So, yes, there were some words prepared for me that I can just quickly. So our final public lecture talk of the year will be taking place on the 15th of December, and it's entitled The Garvalack Islands, Scotland, a rare record of snowball earth, with Elias Rugen. So for those of us who are here in person, we'd like to invite you now to come and join us in a drinks reception, which is taking place in the lower library. Thank you very much.